Imagine walking into a royal ballroom wearing a necklace made of polished dinosaur poop. And everyone around you is jealous. That actually happened. In this video, we're exposing 44 of the weirdest, most absurd things rich people didn't just buy. They obsessed over and paid insane fortunes for. From radioactive health water to humans hired as garden decorations, this is what happens when money outruns logic. 1. Imagine flexing your massive wealth at a high society royal ball by proudly wearing a heavy gold necklace made of literal million-year-old animal crap. That is exactly what the absolute elite of Victorian England did when they became relentlessly obsessed with collecting coprolite, which is just the fancy scientific word for fossilized dinosaur poop. Shrewd miners realized they could dig up these prehistoric turds, polish them until they looked like stunningly expensive glowing gemstones, and sell them to entirely clueless aristocrats for massive fortunes. Dukes and duchesses were genuinely outbidding each other to rock shiny brooches and heavy rings made entirely from ancient feces. It remains the ultimate historical proof that impossibly rich people will buy absolutely anything as long as the price tag is high enough. 2. If you think your hobby is niche, try being a 19th century collector of dead parasites wearing tuxedos. Wealthy eccentrics went absolutely wild for pulgas vestidas, which were literal dead fleas dressed up in tiny handmade cotton outfits. Master craftsmen would use magnifying glasses to glue microscopic skirts, hats, and even tiny musical instruments onto the corpses of fleas. Rich tourists paid surprisingly high prices to own a whole set of these dressed-up pests, displaying them in fancy boxes like a flea circus frozen in time. They were basically paying for the world's smallest dolls to show off to their friends. 3. In the 18th century, European royalty threw unbelievable fortunes at inventors just to own elaborate clockwork toys, with the absolute ultimate prize being a mechanical duck that could literally poop. Wealthy kings became relentlessly obsessed with automata, paying the modern equivalent of millions for jeweled singing birds. The true holy grail for these elite collectors was a giant copper bird created by a French inventor that would gracefully flap its wings, swallow actual grain, and then proudly drop a perfectly formed artificial turd. Impossibly rich aristocrats gladly traveled across the entire continent and paid massive premium fees just to watch a fake metal bird use the bathroom. 4. Forget buying a private jet because the absolute ultimate wealth flex in 18th century Britain was walking around town carrying a single spiky tropical fruit. Wealthy socialites became utterly fanatical about pineapples, treating them like priceless glowing diamonds instead of a tasty snack. Because importing them from the Caribbean was incredibly slow and insanely dangerous, owning just one pineapple cost the modern equivalent of $8,000. But the richest people in society rarely ever ate them. Instead, they bought these rotting fruits just to prominently display them at dinner parties until they literally melted into a stinking puddle of mush. If you could not afford to buy one, you could actually pay a massive fee to simply rent a pineapple for the night. 5. Collecting nuts sounds boring until you hear about the coco de mer. European royalty paid absolute fortunes for these massive, double-lobed coconuts because they looked exactly like a human butt. Before sailors discovered where they grew in the Seychelles, these giant seeds would wash up on beaches, and people genuinely believed they grew on underwater trees. Kings like Rudolph II paid the price of a loaded merchant ship for just one buttnut, polishing them and setting them in gold. They were convinced these mysterious ocean bottoms could neutralize poison, proving that rich people will worship anything if it is rare enough. 6. You might think buying a purebred dog is expensive, but in the 1850s, the world's wealthiest people were remortgaging their houses to buy giant fluffy chickens. A completely bizarre mania called hen fever swept through England and America after Queen Victoria fell in love with these massive birds. Serious bankers and aristocrats started aggressively bidding absolute fortunes for these poultry prices, with a single rooster selling for the modern equivalent of $10,000. People were treating farm animals like rare diamonds, building literal mansions for their birds, and hiring armed guards to protect their coops. The bubble eventually burst, leaving thousands of investors bankrupt and stuck with a backyard full of very expensive, flightless nuggets. 7. Causing a massive national economic crash over a sick onion is still the most hilariously absurd financial disaster in history. During the 1630s, Dutch elites completely lost their minds over mutated tulip bulbs in a bizarre hoarding craze known as tulip mania. Wealthy merchants aggressively outbid each other for a specific striped flower called Semper Augustus, driving prices so astronomically high that one single bulb cost more than a gigantic luxury mansion in Amsterdam. They were liquidating entire family estates and trading massive merchant ships just to own a wrinkled piece of plant matter. The ultimate irony is that the beautiful stripes driving these billionaires totally crazy were actually caused by a destructive plant virus. 8. Trading your massive military army for some fragile bowls sounds like a terrible strategy, but Augustus the Strong thought it was a brilliant bargain. In the early 18th century, the Elector of Saxony developed an obsession with fine Chinese porcelain that bordered on absolute madness. He famously called his addiction the bleeding bowl disease and completely bankrupted his treasury to hoard delicate teacups. His most ridiculous purchase happened when he literally traded a regiment of 600 fully armed dragoons to the King of Prussia in exchange for just 150 porcelain vases. This royal fanatic basically swapped hundreds of elite soldiers on horseback for a bunch of shiny plates he could not even eat off of without accidentally breaking them. 9. Risking your life by aggressively scraping fuzzy weeds off dangerous cliffs was the absolute ultimate Victorian hobby. In the 1850s, the British elite caught a highly contagious obsession known as Fern fever, completely losing their minds over collecting simple forest plants. Wealthy socialites paid massive fortunes to professional botanical hunters just to acquire extremely rare variations of ferns to proudly display in custom glass terrariums. Highly respected ladies and gentlemen would literally climb treacherous mountains and completely ruin their incredibly expensive silk outfits just to steal a tiny green leaf hiding under a damp rock. They blindly spent their massive family inheritances hoarding basic woodland vegetation. 10. Proving how deeply emotional you were in the Victorian era meant aggressively hoarding your own salty eye water in highly expensive glassware. 19th century elites developed a wildly bizarre obsession with collecting lacrimatories, which were beautifully decorated tiny bottles designed strictly for catching tears. Instead of using a simple cloth handkerchief, wealthy mourners would press these custom-made, gold-trimmed glass vials to their faces during funerals to literally bottle their sadness. The more liquid you collected, the more respect you commanded in high society. Once the tears finally evaporated into thin air, the mourning period was officially over, making it the most expensive and highly unhygienic emotional timer ever invented by humanity. 11. Victorian men were so obsessed with their fancy facial hair that they literally invented a whole new category of ceramics to collect. They started hoarding Mustache cups, which were specially designed teacups featuring a weird little porcelain shelf inside the rim. This guard was there to keep their stiff, wax-covered mustaches dry while they drank hot tea, preventing the wax from melting into a gross sludge. Wealthy gentlemen would amass huge collections of these custom cups, painted with gold and flowers, just to protect their precious handlebars. It was basically a sippy cup for grown men who cared more about their upper lip than their dignity. 12. If you think buying a gold phone case is a flex, King Louis XIV of France would laugh in your face. The Sun King became obsessed with collecting solid silver furniture, eventually filling the Palace of Versailles with over 20 tons of it. I am not talking about just silverware. I mean, he had solid silver tables, silver benches, silver mirrors, and even a solid silver balustrade in his bedroom. He literally surrounded himself with so much shiny metal that servants had to wear sunglasses just to enter the room on a sunny day. He basically turned his home into one giant, blindingly expensive spoon, just to prove he was the richest man alive. 13. Risking your life in a sweltering jungle just to steal a tiny houseplant was considered a highly respectable career choice for wealthy Victorians. In the mid-19th century, a completely ridiculous phenomenon called orchid delirium swept through the European aristocracy, turning bored nobles into aggressive flower hoarders. Elite collectors paid mind-boggling fortunes to fund dangerous tropical expeditions just to acquire incredibly rare orchid variations. These ultra-rich plant fanatics would aggressively outbid each other at chaotic London auctions, often dropping thousands of pounds on a single, ugly brown root that might not even survive the boat ride home. They treated fragile tropical weeds like stolen crown jewels. 14. I swear I am not making this up, but one of the greatest military geniuses in history spent an absolute massive fortune hoarding tiny containers for his sneezing powder. King Frederick the Great of Prussia completely blew his royal budget collecting jewel-encrusted snuff boxes, eventually amassing over 300 of them. We are talking about little tins covered in flawless diamonds, rubies, and solid gold, each costing the equivalent of a modern luxury mansion. He literally dragged these priceless, shiny boxes onto muddy battlefields just so he could aggressively flex his nose tobacco on his generals. Imagine having the infinite wealth of an entire European empire and dumping it all into bedazzled little cans. 15. You know how some people today flex their wealth with crazy sports cars? Well, in the 17th century, European royalty flexed by hoarding literal oranges. Kings and super wealthy dukes became utterly obsessed with collecting imported citrus trees, building massive glass palaces called Orangeries just to keep them alive through winter. These fragile trees had to be manually carried indoors and outdoors by exhausted servants whenever the weather shifted. They were dropping the modern equivalent of millions just to grow a few sour lemons in freezing northern France. All that effort for a glass of slightly sour juice. 16. Placing a beautifully carved marble statue in your garden is perfectly normal. But wealthy Georgian aristocrats preferred collecting unwashed, living humans to decorate their lawns. The absolute biggest status symbol in 18th century England was hiring a personal ornamental hermit to live in a custom-built cave on your sprawling estate. Elite landowners would place literal job ads offering massive fortunes to any man willing to sit in their garden for 7 years without cutting his hair, taking a bath, or speaking to anyone. These impossibly rich lords would proudly walk their party guests through the woods just to point at a dirty old man reading a book in a fake grotto. 17. Serving your dinner guests a plate totally covered in creepy bugs sounds like a horrible prank, but 16th century French royalty paid astronomical fortunes for exactly that. They became fanatically obsessed with palissyware, which were giant ceramic platters completely covered with hyper-realistic, three-dimensional snakes, lizards, and toads. Master potters literally made plaster molds out of real swamp creatures to create these incredibly expensive plates that looked just like a terrifying mud puddle. Wealthy nobles thought it was the peak of comedy to serve a fancy royal meal on these things, just to watch their distinguished guests freak out when a ceramic snake poked out of their food. 18. Think about how absolutely hilarious it is that 18th century gentlemen spent giant fortunes hoarding literal sticks. Wealthy aristocrats across Europe developed a massive obsession with collecting highly decorative walking canes, even though they almost never used them for actual walking. A true gentleman needed a different, incredibly expensive cane for every possible occasion, dropping thousands on sticks carved from rare ivory, solid silver, or extinct animal horns. Some crazy collectors even bought expensive gadget canes with hidden compartments for tiny telescopes, perfume, or mini alcohol flasks. They were basically the historical equivalent of a Swiss Army knife, completely bankrupting grown men who just wanted to hold a really cool stick. 19. This one is going to blow your mind. If you ever visit an ancient Roman ruin and wonder why so many marble statues are missing their noses, it is because rich European tourists literally stole them for their home collections. During the 18th century, wealthy young aristocrats traveling across Italy became obsessed with collecting statue fragments to prove how cultured they were. Since they could not fit an entire 10-ton marble gladiator into a carriage, they paid shady guides a fortune to break off the noses and ears of priceless statues. They shipped these random facial features back to London, turning their mansions into very expensive and deeply unsettling stone body part galleries. 20. Before electricity, the ultimate status symbol for French royalty was eating dinner off of plates made from aluminium. In the mid-19th century, refining aluminium was so incredibly difficult that it was actually more valuable than gold. Emperor Napoleon III became obsessed with collecting this lightweight, dull metal. At his lavish royal banquets, the most important VIP guests were given the supreme honor of eating with aluminium forks and spoons, while the regular, boring nobility had to settle for common gold utensils. It is hilarious to think that the richest man in France was hoarding the same metal we now use to wrap leftover sandwiches. 21. Imagine hiring a master architect to design a breathtaking luxury mansion, paying a massive fortune for it, and then exclusively letting an angry parrot live inside. That is exactly what 18th century Georgian elites did when they became totally obsessed with collecting architectural bird cages. These absurdly wealthy aristocrats demanded giant, custom-built wire cages shaped like famous castles, towering cathedrals, and classic Roman temples. Some of these intricate cages were literally so gigantic that the rich owners could physically walk inside them just to hang out with their pet finches. They casually dropped the price of a real human house just to make sure their exotic birds had way better real estate than 90% of the entire country. 22. If you think modern scams are bad, you have to hear about the great shell hustle of the 18th century. Wealthy European collectors went absolutely feral for a specific sea snail shell called the precious Wenteltrap, paying the modern equivalent of $20,000 for a single specimen. They were so desperate to own this spiral calcium trophy that clever Chinese artisans realized they could just fake them using old rice paste. They flooded the market with fragile noodle shells, and the best part is that the European experts were so obsessed they could not even tell the difference. Rich dudes were literally emptying their bank accounts to proudly display a shelf full of dried pasta disguised as rare biology. 23. Imagine being so afraid of food poisoning that you decide to dip a hairy rock from a goat's stomach into your wine glass. For centuries, the absolute ultimate collectible for paranoid royalty was the Bezoar stone, which is literally a calcified hairball found in the guts of grazing animals. Kings and queens paid more for these gross digestive lumps than they did for solid gold because they truly believed dropping one in a drink would neutralize any poison. Queen Elizabeth I famously wore one set in silver, strutting around her court with a glamorous piece of animal indigestion jewelry. It is hands down the most expensive placebo effect in human history. 24. Vikings basically pulled off the greatest marketing prank of the last millennium by selling whale teeth to gullible rich people. For hundreds of years, wealthy monarchs paid astronomical sums for what they thought were magical unicorn horns, capable of curing all diseases. In reality, they were just buying the long, spiral tusks of narwhals, a very real and very ugly whale from the Arctic. Queen Elizabeth I bought one for £10,000, which was the price of a massive castle at the time. She essentially traded a fortress for a piece of whale tooth because no one bothered to check if unicorns were actually real. 25. We all know that one person who loves their dollhouse, but Petronella Ortmann took it to a level that technically qualifies as insanity. In late 17th century Amsterdam, this wealthy wife spent nearly 30,000 guilders building a miniature cabinet house, which was enough money to buy a literal, full-sized mansion on the most expensive canal in the city. She did not just buy toys. She commissioned real cabinet makers, glassblowers, and silversmiths to create fully functional tiny furniture and porcelain. She spent a genuine fortune creating a fake house that she could not even fit inside, proving that rich people will shrink their assets just to feel like giants. 26. You might love sweet treats, but European royalty in the 16th century took their sugar addiction to a level that was medically insane. Sugar was so incredibly expensive it was literally called white gold, yet wealthy monarchs insisted on collecting massive, edible sculptures called subtleties to flex on their guests. We are talking about life-sized castles, mythological beasts, and entire battle scenes made purely out of sugar paste that cost more than a fully equipped warship. The funniest part is that nobody was allowed to actually eat these sticky masterpieces. Guests just sat there for hours, staring at a melting sugar fortress while their teeth rotted just from looking at the price tag. 27. We usually pay to get rid of pests, but in the 1920s, wealthy people paid fortunes to drink them. The craze for radium sparked an obsession with radioactive health products, the most famous being the Revigator. This ceramic water jug was lined with uranium ore that released radon gas into drinking water overnight. Educated elites paid serious money to own these so-called health fountains, chugging radium-infused miracle water every morning to invigorate themselves. They were literally paying premium prices to slowly poison their own bodies, convinced that if it glowed, it had to be good for you. 28. Imagine selling 20 acres of prime farmland just to buy a piece of fabric to blow your nose in. In the 17th century, aristocrats became dangerously obsessed with handmade lace. Some collars took over 2,000 hours to weave by hand, and a single piece could cost the equivalent of a small estate. Families literally bankrupted themselves trying to keep up with lace fashion. It got so out of control that governments passed sumptuary laws banning certain types because nobles were financially self-destructing over decorative thread. Wealthy elites were sewing the price of a village onto their sleeves just to flex at dinner. 29. Sir Thomas Phillips didn't just collect books. He declared war on literacy itself. The 19th century baronet obsessively tried to own one copy of every book in existence, eventually hoarding over 160,000 manuscripts and printed volumes. His mansion became so crammed with paper that floors reportedly sagged under the weight and hallways turned into unstable book tunnels. His family absolutely despised the obsession, and he drove himself deep into debt chasing auctions across Europe. He didn't just collect knowledge, he buried his entire life under it. 30. We all have keys for our houses and cars, but 18th century British ladies carried heavy iron keys just to protect their dried leaves. When tea first arrived in Europe, it was so absurdly expensive that it triggered a massive wave of tea theft by desperate servants. In response, wealthy hostesses began obsessively collecting beautiful, locking wooden boxes called tea caddies. The lady of the house would wear the key around her neck at all times like a prison warden, terrified that a maid might steal a pinch of her precious Earl Grey. They treated a cup of hot leaf water like it was liquid gold, locking it up in a fortress just to have a morning brew. 31. Napoleon Bonaparte was a polarizing figure, but after his death, wealthy collectors went absolutely ferocious trying to buy his garbage. A bizarre industry exploded where rich Europeans paid massive fortunes for anything the emperor might have touched. We are talking about people bidding thousands for his used toothbrush, his socks, and even the water from his final bath. One fanatical collector paid a premium price to own a piece of the wallpaper from the room where Napoleon died. These were grown, wealthy adults fighting over a dead man's toiletries just to put them in a glass case and stare at them. 32. Today we toss salt on food without thinking, but in the Middle Ages, holding salt was a full-blown status display. Wealthy lords competed to own elaborate salt cellars known as neffs, massive sailing ship sculptures made from solid gold and silver. These intricate ships sat in front of the host at banquets, proudly holding nothing but a tiny pile of salt crystals. Your entire social ranking depended on whether you sat above the salt ship or below it. They spent the price of a real boat on a decorative toy boat just to season their meat. Medieval billionaires were wild. 33. If you think spicy food is a trend now, you should see the nutmeg craze of the 18th century. Wealthy gentlemen decided that the ultimate accessory was a personal, pocket-sized silver nutmeg grater. They carried these expensive little gadgets everywhere, whipping out a whole nutmeg nut at taverns to grate fresh spice into their stale beer or wine. It was the historical equivalent of carrying a diamond-encrusted hot sauce bottle in your pocket. The nutmeg itself was so rare that the Dutch fought actual wars over the Spice Islands. Also, some fancy guy in London could flamboyantly dust his drink and look cool in front of his friends. 34. Most people collect useful things, but Emperor Rudolph II spent his entire reign hoarding junk that supposedly possessed magical powers. His cabinet of curiosities in Prague was a legendary mess of absolute nonsense that he bought for astronomical sums. He had a collection of mandrake roots that he dressed in tiny little outfits, thinking they were living creatures. He also paid a fortune for a bowl that was allegedly made from the horn of a hydra, which is a mythical monster that does not even exist. He was basically the richest man in Europe, yet he spent his fortune like a gullible tourist buying magic beans at a roadside carnival. 35. Imagine having so much money that you start buying entire buildings just to keep them in boxes. William Randolph Hearst, the American media tycoon, had an addiction to collecting that was truly pathological. He would travel to Europe, buy entire ancient monasteries or ceilings from Spanish castles, have them dismantled stone by stone, and shipped to New York. The crazy part is that he bought so much stuff that he never even unpacked most of it. Acres of warehouses were filled with crates containing priceless medieval architecture that he bought for millions and then just forgot about. He was essentially playing real-life Minecraft with world history. 36. While modern millionaires stack gold bars, medieval elites locked up peppercorns like they were vault-grade treasure. Black pepper was so insanely valuable that it functioned as literal currency, used to pay rent, taxes, and even war ransoms. When Alaric the Visigoth besieged Rome, he demanded 3,000 pounds of pepper as part of the payoff. Imagine being robbed at knife point for seasoning. Merchants hoarded sacks of dried berries in secure rooms, like edible bullion. Entire fortunes were measured not in coins, but in how spicy your vault smelled. 37. Paying an architect an absolute fortune to build a brand new castle that looks like it was just destroyed by a massive catapult was the ultimate bizarre status symbol. Wealthy British lords in the 18th century developed an uncontrollable obsession with collecting ancient ruins, but since there were not enough real ones to go around, they simply faked them. They poured astronomical sums of money into building massive, completely useless structures called follies on their manicured lawns. These elite landowners would hire top designers to construct crumbling stone towers and shattered Roman temples that were purposely designed to look absolutely terrible. It was the historical equivalent of paying premium gold for a car with broken wheels. 38. Highly educated Victorian women once treated slimy ocean weeds like elite trading cards. During the 19th century, seaweed collecting exploded into a full-blown upper-class obsession. Wealthy ladies marched across freezing beaches in silk dresses just to scrape soggy algae off rocks, then paid luxury bookbinders to press and preserve it inside ornate leather albums. They even hosted elegant tea parties to show off their latest specimens, essentially forcing guests to admire pages of dried ocean salad. Unlimited wealth, unlimited time, and you choose decorative sea slime. 39. Forget buying a guard dog. Wealthy Victorians spent their life savings on vampire hunting kits to protect them from imaginary monsters. Tourists traveling to Eastern Europe would drop massive fortunes on these fancy wooden boxes lined with velvet and packed with silver bullets, wooden stakes, garlic essence, and crucifixes. The funniest part is that clever antique dealers were just assembling random junk and selling it to terrified rich people who read too many scary novels. These guys were walking around with a suitcase full of holy water, fully prepared to fight Dracula, while the locals probably laughed at them for buying an expensive box of nonsense. 40. We usually hide our bathroom habits, but French ladies in the 18th century proudly carried theirs in their purses. They became obsessed with collecting bordeleus, elegant porcelain vessels shaped like gravy boats that were used for discreetly relieving themselves during long church sermons. These pieces were beautifully painted with flowers and gold leaf, looking more like fine dining ware than a portable toilet. Wealthy women paid large sums for the most elaborate designs so they could avoid leaving the pew mid-sermon. They literally spent fortunes to pee in a decorative soup bowl. History is classy until it isn't. 41. Showing off your impossible wealth in the early 19th century meant paying absolute fortunes for frozen water that would literally disappear in just a few days. Before any mechanical cooling existed, elite socialites across Europe and India became obsessed with collecting pure ice blocks shipped completely halfway across the world from frozen New England lakes. Wealthy hosts would proudly display massive imported ice sculptures at their lavish summer dinner parties just to watch their ridiculous investment slowly melt onto the dining room floor. Buying premium imported ice was insanely expensive because most of it turned into puddles during the brutal months-long ship rides. Rich nobles basically threw away their gold just to give their wealthy guests a slightly chilly beverage. 42. Showing off your wealth in the Renaissance meant owning a pet that would actively destroy your house. Rich Europeans became obsessed with keeping monkeys as luxury accessories. They would dress these poor animals in tiny, expensive velvet jackets and let them run wild at dinner parties. The monkeys would smash priceless porcelain, bite guests, and throw food everywhere. But the owners loved it because only a truly wealthy person could afford such chaos. It was the ultimate flex. I am so rich I can let a wild animal wear silk and wreck my dining room, and I do not even care. 43. Young women in the 19th century actually managed to turn basic clothing fasteners into a fiercely competitive luxury sport. They became incredibly obsessed with collecting thousands of unique, highly decorated buttons and threading them onto massive charm strings. We are talking about wealthy girls paying completely insane prices for hand-painted glass buttons, carved mother-of-pearl, and heavy brass buttons plucked right off real military uniforms. The absolute craziest rule was that once you collected exactly 999 unique buttons on your string, legend said you would immediately meet your future husband. So rich families were actively emptying their bank accounts on tiny, shiny circles just to guarantee a wedding ring. 44. The ultimate scam that rich people begged to be a part of was collecting authentic mermaids to display in their private cabinets. In the Victorian era, gullible millionaires paid massive sums for creatures like the Fiji mermaid, convinced they were buying a preserved mythological species. In reality, they were paying for a shriveled monkey's torso crudely sewn onto the back half of a fish and covered in papier-mâché. These wealthy collectors were so desperate to own a monster that they completely ignored the fact that their mermaid looked like a dried-up fish stick with teeth, happily emptying their bank accounts for a literal glued-together prank. After seeing all this, the real question isn't why they did it. It's what we missed, because history is packed with even more ridiculous collections than the ones you just saw. So tell me, what insane, bizarre, or totally unhinged rich person obsession did we forget to include? And don't play safe. If you made it this far, prove it. Drop the wildest one in the comments. Like the video if this blew your mind, and subscribe if you're ready for even stranger history.